Rumplestiltskin, The True Story by Brad Tuttle. Some of our best love stories are based on events that really happened. Over the years, however, most of these stories have changed. A father tells the story to his little girl. Because she loves magic, the father adds a little magic here and a little magic there. Later, when the girl grows up and tells the story to her children, she also changes it just a bit to make the story sound more interesting. And so, the story continues to change until the one we know hardly resembles the original event. Take, for example, the true story of Rumpelstiltskin. Many years ago, a kindly king ruled a small kingdom. Neither the king nor the citizens of his small country were especially rich, but neither were they poor. The peasants lived in cottages that were neither too big nor too small. Likewise, the king and queen lived in a castle that was neither too large nor too small as far as castles go. Still, even their simple castle had a great number of rooms and marvelous halls. There were tall towers and deep dark dungeons, lofty rooms of state, and great outdoor courts where lords and ladies strolled on sunny days. In one grand room was a table with seats for 100 knights, along with servants to set food in piles before them. The king and queen lived happily for many years. Their only son, Prince Red, had everything a young prince needed. The king taught him to be brave in the face of danger, quick in combat, and wise in judgment. His mother, the queen, taught the prince compassion and a love for nature. Indeed, the prince loved all that lived and spent much of his time nurturing the small animals that he often found wounded or lost near the castle. He nursed many baby birds until they could fly. Soft, clean deer from the king's forest would eat from his hand. It didn't matter whether the creature crawled or flew. The prince befriended them all. The prince's favorite pet, however, was a snow-white rat that visited him every day in his room. The rodent appeared quite precisely just at bedtime. He would sit on his hind legs, as if to say, "Please feed me some of your smelly cheese." So fond did the prince become of this faithful friend that he had the smith create a little gold collar on a gold chain just for the rat. It was a beautiful piece of artwork, and the prince could hardly wait until bedtime when the rat would come to visit. That evening, when the white rat appeared, the prince placed the beautiful chain around its neck. This obviously pleased the animal greatly. He danced about the prince's room, doing somersaults and little jigs. At last, the rat climbed on top of the dresser to face the prince closely in the eye. He nodded a giant thank you and then disappeared, never to return to the prince's room. Time passed, and the prince's mind was turned to a different type of creature. It was time that the prince find a princess to marry. The king sent letters to all the eligible princesses, requesting them to come to the castle. One by one, they came, and oh, what a parade they made! Each came with horsemen and coachmen, flags and trumpets. They wore costumes of the finest linen. Each had skin as white as the lily and lips as red as the rose. But as beautiful as princesses are, none satisfied the king and queen. What they desired was a princess who was as beautiful inside as she was outside. For the wise parents knew that the great heart of the prince was worthy of such a girl. Now, all of this princess activity required lots of money. Every time a princess arrived, there was a grand party with lots of food and dancing. All the gentlemen and ladies were invited, and for many months, the kingdom was decorated as if a holiday were in progress. At last, the money on hand was gone, and the king instructed the Minister of Finance to invade the royal treasury to get more money. The king's treasure was kept in a room deep in the interior of the castle. Its walls were made of solid, thick rock, and there were no windows and only one small, heavy door. Only 2 people in the kingdom had a key to this room. One was the Minister of Finance, and the other was the king himself. Taking several armed guards for security and 3 strong servants to carry the sacks of gold, the minister proceeded to the treasury. Down long corridors and beyond countless sealed entrances, they progressed until at length they stood at the small, thick door. The minister himself, turned the massive key and pushed open the stubborn door to reveal the king's wealth. But to everyone's astonishment, the room was empty. Not a single gold coin lay on the bare shelves. The Minister of Finance turned stone gray and collapsed in the doorway. He was immediately arrested and carried before the king as a traitor and thief. The king and all his cabinet were wise and sympathetic to the plight of the minister, for it was obvious to them that he had no part in the theft. However, the kingdom was now a financial ruin, and unless money could be obtained soon, the king and his entire household would be disgraced. There was no alternative but to raise taxes, and so throughout the kingdom, tax collectors visited the home of every citizen and peasant. The king hoped to find the thief and to recover his fortune. Therefore, he only required a small tax so as not to burden his faithful countrymen. Of course, news about the empty treasury spread as fast as the tax collectors, and so the citizens were eager to aid the royal family, who were now as poor as themselves. Many contributed extra, so that when the monies were counted and again stored in the treasury, the room was full. Even in the light of a single candle, the room glowed, blinding the beholder with a yellow gleam. The small, thick door was shut, and the lock changed. For added precaution, a guard was stationed on the outside at all times. These actions having satisfied the king, his attention was again turned to the problems of running the kingdom. Strangely, however, no evidence was ever discovered to show who stole the money. The mystery greatly perplexed the entire kingdom, but especially the king. Eventually, the king grew uneasy and felt it might be a good idea to count the money in the treasury. He summoned the Minister of Finance and charged him to count the money. For the second time, the guards and servants accompanied the Minister of Finance to the small closed room, and once again, when the door was unlocked and opened, the room was empty. The minister fell to his knees and cried. This time the sad king had no choice but to lock the minister in the dungeon and send again for the tax collectors. This time, the citizens were not so generous. Some complained that the king should keep better track of his money. Others believed that an enemy had stolen the money or deluded the king. Some even talked about spies and magic. Nevertheless, the tax was collected and the treasury again filled. A double guard was posted at the door. After only a month, the king again became concerned about his money. Only this time, he personally accompanied the guards and the new Minister of Finance to the treasury. No one can imagine the king's surprise and dismay when the open door revealed an utterly empty and barren room. The king knew that he had taxed his country to the limit, but how could he be a king without any money? For days, the king sat on his throne in grief. No one could console him, and no one could devise a solution to the kingdom's financial predicament. Even the tax collectors feared that they would soon lose their jobs. One day, a messenger for the king was passing the mill where lived a miller and his daughter. He overheard the miller talking with a peasant. "I don't know why this is such a hard problem for the king," said the miller. "I'm only a miller, but even I know how to solve the king's money problems." The royal messenger stopped and confronted the miller. "How could you, a poor miller, solve the king's money problems?" demanded the messenger. The miller, who was known by his friends to exaggerate the truth, bragged, "That is easy, good sir. My daughter can spin straw into gold." Seeing that the miller was nothing but a fool, the messenger gave him a good knock and left shaking his head. When the messenger returned to the castle, he went into the king as was his duty. After delivering the message, he was about to excuse himself, but seeing the king in his sad state, thought it might cheer the king to relate the story of the miller and his daughter. Indeed, the king's countenance did seem to lighten with its telling, until at last that he exploded for joy. "Bring me the miller and his daughter," commanded the king. Everyone was dumbstruck. Apparently, the king's anxiety was so grave that he was willing to grasp at the slightest glimmer of hope, even one so remote as spinning straw into gold. But the king had given a command, and no one dared counter it. Guards were sent, and the miller, along with his daughter, soon found themselves waiting outside the great throne room of their king. By this time, both the queen and prince were at the throne out of concern for the ailing king. They, along with all the chief advisors of the court, pleaded with the king to choose another course. But no alternatives could be offered, and so their persuasions failed to turn the king from his purpose. Eventually, they had no choice but to admit the boastful miller and his unfortunate daughter before the throne. Of course, the miller was beside himself with fear and anguish. He knew only too well what would happen when the king found out his fraud. All the while, his daughter tried to console him, as she knew nothing of her father's brag. When she finally turned to face the royal family, a quiet hush settled on the court. The miller's daughter was more beautiful and more graceful than any princess they had ever seen. The prince fell instantly in love. So caught up in this last chance to save his kingdom was the king that he was oblivious to the magic in his son's eyes or the slight blush in the beautiful girl's cheeks. He commanded a spinning wheel to be placed in the treasury, and the room filled with straw. Then he commanded the girl to spin the straw into gold. If she failed, both she and her father would spend the remainder of their lives in the prison. The father was removed to the prison while complaining loudly that he never meant such a boast, and the poor girl was led to the designated room. Once locked inside the damp room, the seriousness of the situation began to settle upon the poor girl. All she could do for quite some time was sob. But then she heard a slight noise at the far end of the room. Wiping her tear-clouded eyes and lifting the candle a little higher, she saw a snow-white rat staring back at her from the corner of the room. Around its neck was a gold chain, and in its mouth was a gold coin. She offered the rat a piece of her bread, but he did not move. Likewise, the rat cared nothing for the water in her cup. "Oh well," thought the girl, "I was foolish to think that a single gold coin would save me or my father anyway." But then the girl imagined that the rat's eyes were fixed on something. Could it be, she asked herself. She held out a single stick of straw. The rat acted as though she had offered it something very grand. He quickly dropped the coin and snatched up the straw in his mouth. He danced a little jig before scampering through a small hole in the corner of the dark room, taking the straw with him. The girl swept the coin next to her and thought how curious this encounter had been. No sooner, however, had she gathered the coin than the rat reappeared with another one. She again offered him a straw. Again, the rat very eagerly traded straw for money. This scene repeated itself throughout the night until it was nearly dawn. The miller's daughter now sat atop a room full of coins. One final time the rat appeared, but this time in its mouth was a large ring containing a ruby the size of a grape. She offered the rat her last straw while trying to coax it closer. The rat came close enough for her to see that there was something written on the gold collar before trading the straw for the ring. She placed the ring inside her garments and waited. That morning, the king woke up earlier than the sun. He called the Minister of Finance and summoned the guards. The king practically flew to the room where the miller's daughter waited. To everyone's great surprise and delight, when the door opened, a flood of gold coins poured out on the small group. Dancing with joy, the king proclaimed his kingdom saved, and that the miracle was a sign that the prince should marry the miller's daughter. Of course, no one was more pleased with this arrangement than the prince. What a wonderful celebration ensued. The entire kingdom rejoiced at the threefold miracle. First, the restoration of the king's treasure meant that taxes would cease. Second, the prince had found a wife who was more beautiful than all the stars in the heaven. And third, the citizens rejoiced that one of their own was chosen to wed the prince rather than an unknown girl from a faraway land. And so, the country felt a special kinship with the miller's daughter. The miller was handsomely rewarded and appointed to be the new Minister of Finance. To him, his daughter suggested that certain changes be made to the treasury. In particular, she suggested keeping the money inside small chests rather than leaving it in piles upon the shelves. The miller heeded her suggestion, so that never again did a single coin disappear. The new Minister of Finance was very grateful, although he sometimes boasted about his own ability to protect the king's fortune. Approximately 1 year later, the miller's daughter gave the kingdom another reason to rejoice, for the sound of a baby's cry was heard inside the castle. A new little princess was born. Banners proclaimed the event, and neighboring kingdoms sent letters of congratulations, accompanied by lavish presents. Everyone sang and danced. Truly, there never were happier people in all the earth. All their happiness and rejoicing, however, was short-lived, for in the middle of their celebration, an army as numberless as the sands of the sea was seen near the borders of the kingdom. The distressed king, who was now becoming quite old, sent an embassy to greet the army and to find out their intent. Their reply was to surrender or become extinct. The kingdom's bravest knights banded together into a small army to challenge the enemy host, but were swept away like so many flies. It was no use. Eventually, the castle fell, and the invading king entered the throne room to dictate the terms of surrender to the helpless royal family. The meeting began with several long speeches about the glorious power possessed by the conquering monarch. It seemed to continue forever, a never-ending tirade of battles fought and kingdoms won. Finally, the miller, who could not stand to hear anyone but himself boast, cried out to the enemy king, "Stop! You boast only of the strength and power of your armies. We are not impressed. What makes man different from the animals is his mind. Even the weakest member of our court can match wits with you." You can imagine the horror that fell upon the little royal family as they listened to the miller's boast. You may also imagine the effect that this insult had upon the mighty enemy king. In his anger, he vowed right away to prove the miller's boast, and the evil king demanded that Miller's daughter come forward, as she was obviously the weakest member of the royal family. Still holding her baby princess, the terrified girl trembled before the angry monarch.
"I shall ask you a riddle," roared the conquering king. "If you can answer the riddle by tomorrow at sunrise, I shall leave your land and never return. However, should you fail, I shall own your child daughter as payment and take your kingdom as my own."
"Here is the riddle," continued the king in a very peculiar and evil tone. "Came each evening to visit the king, danced before him with a golden chain, stole the king's heart, then disappeared. No one here can guess the name." With that, the poor miller's daughter was led to a small dark room in the innermost part of the castle, where no sound from the world above could possibly reach her. Here, they locked her inside, and 7 very angry-looking guards with swords in hand were stationed on the outside. Feeling quite smug, the evil king retired for the evening, believing that he alone knew the secret to the riddle. Of course, the miller's daughter recognized the riddle as soon as it was spoken. Who else but the white rat came at night to dance with a gold chain? The young girl decided that the white rat must have hidden in a merchant's cart and thus traveled to the very castle of the enemy king and somehow back again. But what was the rat's name? Perhaps the prince knew, but there was no opportunity to ask her husband, as she was so heavily guarded. Her only hope was for the rat to come and reveal to her his secret name. But how could she possibly learn anything from an animal that lacked the power of human speech? As her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, she recognized something familiar about her surroundings. Indeed, she was once again in the very same room next to the treasury where the white rat had once traded straw for gold. This realization gave the girl some degree of hope. All she could do now, however, was to wait. And wait she did. The hours passed by so very slowly. Several times she thought she heard something, or perhaps she saw something move, but each time it was only her cruel imagination. At last the sky began to lighten, and the poor girl began to cry for the certain loss of her child. But then she saw it. Something white moved in the far corner of the room. Hurriedly, she searched for a token or straw, anything gold to offer the creature. Nothing. From far away she could hear the noise of men approaching. There was little time. Then she remembered the ruby ring still tucked away in her garments. Quickly she searched among her clothing until the ring was produced. Offering the ring to the rat, she coaxed it closer and closer until the creature was very, very near. So close that this time she could read the name inscribed on its collar. Away scampered the rat, holding the ruby ring in its mouth. The rat disappeared through its small hole just as the door was flung open. The soldiers herded the girl to the throne room, where her distraught family stood to the side in grim silence. Sitting on the throne that once belonged to her father-in-law sat the evil king. The miller's daughter wondered if the beastly king enjoyed this sport. "Well," said the king, "we are about to see who has a right to boast. Let us hear the answer to my riddle. I am in a pleasant mood. For this, you shall have 3 guesses, after which I have other matters to attend to." The miller's daughter was left to stand alone in the middle of the great room. Although she was confident inside, she pretended to be afraid. "Great king," she said, "the riddle you put forth is most difficult." The king nodded, and the corners of his mouth turned slightly up. Who or what could come to the king each evening and dance without revealing its name to anyone, unless it were a bird or animal? And what animal could steal the king's heart, unless the heart were made of stone, perhaps a garnet, or, more likely, a ruby? The king's smile turned to an ugly scowl. It was clear to all that the girl had answered accurately and with great wisdom. One moment the king's anger boiled. The next moment his face burst with perplexity. And last there was anxiety, the kind of worry that evil experiences when it senses its own defeat. The king jumped to his feet. "You think you are wise," bellowed the king. "But remember, you must tell me the name. The name is what you cannot know." The girl knew that she had beaten the proud king. Still, she pretended fear and replied, "You are right, dread king. I can only guess that the animal was a crow, and that its name was Elizabeth." Relief quickly enveloped the king as he sat down. "No, foolish child, you are wrong." "Oh dear," replied the miller's daughter. "Could it be that a snake named James is the dancing thief?" By now, the king was smiling again. "I am beginning to bore. Tell me your final guess, that I may be done with this game." "If it wasn't a crow and it wasn't a snake, then it most certainly must have been a rat," stated the miller's daughter as she boldly faced the king. "And if it was a rat, it most certainly would be named Rumplestiltskin, for that is the only name for a rat that would steal a king's ruby ring." All who were present knew immediately that the miller's daughter had solved that riddle, including the king's generals and his guards. "Impossible!" roared the king. "I have been humiliated by this meaningless nothing." And with that, the evil king stomped from the room, all the while shouting curses at his men and crashing all that was in his way. The wicked army retreated with their beaten king, never to return. This was the final time that the miller's daughter was called upon to save the kingdom. Many more children were born to the prince and the miller's daughter, and every one of them will attest to the true story of Rumplestiltskin, for they heard it from their own mother. The end.